By the final decades of the 4th century CE, the Roman Empire still governed vast territories, collected taxes, issued laws, and fielded armies across Western Europe. Imperial institutions remained visible and operational. Yet beneath this appearance of continuity, the systems that sustained Roman authority were under sustained strain, increasingly unable to respond to mounting internal pressures and external challenges. During the 4th century, the Western Roman Empire confronted a convergence of long-term structural problems rather than a single moment of failure. Demographic contraction reduced the tax base in several provinces, particularly in Britain, northern Gaul, and parts of Hispania. Archaeological surveys from these regions indicate declining population density in rural settlements and reduced maintenance of urban infrastructure, including roads, baths, and civic buildings. Coin hoards from the later 4th century also reveal a sharp decrease in small-denomination currency circulation, suggesting both fiscal stress and weakened local market exchange. Imperial revenues struggled to meet escalating military costs. The Roman army had expanded significantly since the 3rd century, with greater reliance on mobile field armies stationed away from traditional frontier zones. Maintaining these forces required substantial taxation in kind and cash. Records indicate that tax collection increasingly relied on local elites, binding provincial aristocracies more tightly to imperial administration but also intensifying resentment toward the state. Legal texts from the Codex Theodosianus reflect repeated imperial attempts to prevent tax evasion and the abandonment of municipal responsibilities by curial classes. Administrative fragmentation compounded these financial pressures. Reforms initiated under Diocletian and Constantine had divided provinces into smaller units and separated civilian from military authority. While intended to improve efficiency and limit usurpation, this system increased bureaucratic complexity and coordination costs. Communication across Western provinces became slower and less reliable, particularly in regions distant from imperial courts in Milan or Ravenna. Archaeological evidence from Britain suggests that by the late 4th century, imperial supply systems had weakened significantly, with military installations increasingly dependent on local resources. Military overstretch further exposed institutional fragility. The Rhine and Danube frontiers required constant defense, yet troop deployments were frequently redirected to suppress internal revolts or respond to emergencies elsewhere. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, frontier units were often understrength, inadequately supplied, and slow to receive reinforcements. This vulnerability became increasingly apparent after 376 CE, when large Gothic groups crossed the Danube seeking asylum within imperial territory. Initially accepted under negotiated terms, these populations quickly overwhelmed Roman administrative capacity, leading to breakdowns in provisioning and control. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE marked a significant military setback, resulting in the death of Emperor Valens and the destruction of a substantial Roman field army. While not fatal in itself, the defeat exposed systemic weaknesses in recruitment, command coordination, and intelligence. Subsequent emperors, particularly Theodosius I, relied heavily on federate troops, non-Roman soldiers serving under their own leaders, to stabilize imperial defenses. This practice increased short-term military manpower but diluted centralized control over armed force. Throughout the late 4th century, imperial authorities pursued reform rather than retreat. Constantine's earlier standardization of currency and legal administration, along with Theodosius' religious legislation, aimed to reinforce unity and authority. However, these measures could not fully reverse the erosion of institutional capacity in the Western provinces. Inscriptions and building programs increasingly clustered around imperial centers, while peripheral regions experienced administrative thinning rather than renewal. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by the forces of Alaric has often been portrayed as the moment of collapse. Contemporary reactions, including those of Jerome and Augustine, underscore its psychological impact. Yet archaeologically, Rome itself continued to function as an urban center after the event. The sack represented a symbolic rupture rather than a decisive structural break. It demonstrated that the imperial government could no longer guarantee security even in its historic core, undermining confidence in central authority across the Western provinces. By the early 5th century, Western Roman governance remained operational but increasingly reactive, dependent on negotiation, accommodation, and regional compromise. The cumulative effect of fiscal strain, administrative fragmentation, military overstretch, and demographic contraction had reduced the empire's capacity to enforce uniform rule. These conditions did not eliminate Roman institutions overnight, but they created a political environment in which alternative centers of power could emerge and persist. By the opening decades of the 5th century, Roman authority in Western Europe had weakened sufficiently that new political actors began to operate within imperial territory, reshaping the balance of power that would define the post-Roman world. Before we continue exploring the transformation of late Roman Europe, consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell icon to receive your daily Nightfall history video. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this period intrigued you the most? Political authority did not vanish, it fragmented and localized. Across Western Europe, the weakening of central Roman power created both space and necessity for new political actors, as migrating peoples moved into former imperial provinces. These movements were not simple invasions. They reflected negotiated settlement, military alliances, and integration with residual Roman structures. Following the sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric and his Visigothic forces, the western provinces faced continuing instability, but the collapse of imperial authority was gradual rather than immediate. Gothic populations had initially entered the empire under formal agreements as foederati, groups allowed to settle in exchange for military service. Archaeological evidence from burial sites in southern Gaul and the Balkans shows continuity in material culture alongside new funerary practices introduced by Gothic communities. These hybrid settlements suggest that interaction between Roman and barbarian populations was dynamic, producing local governance arrangements rather than simple displacement. The Vandals, who migrated through Gaul into the Iberian Peninsula before moving to North Africa, similarly negotiated settlements with Roman authorities. Contemporary chronicles, including the writings of Hydatius, describe the distribution of land to accommodate migrating groups while maintaining some level of tax and tribute obligations. Legal codes such as the Lex Romana Visigothorum, issued in the early 6th century but based on precedents from these interactions, reflect a deliberate effort to reconcile Roman law with the customs of new rulers. These texts confirm that integration and adaptation were central to post-Roman governance. The Burgundians and Suebi likewise settled in parts of Gaul and Hispania through foedus agreements, exercising military and civil authority in their respective territories. Excavations in Burgundy and Galicia demonstrate continuity in urban habitation and infrastructure maintenance, with modifications to fortifications and administrative centers that incorporated both Roman and Germanic architectural techniques. Numismatic evidence suggests that local minting continued under regional rulers, reflecting ongoing economic integration with residual imperial systems. Political organization increasingly shifted from centralized imperial oversight to regional kingship. In Visigothic Gaul and later Hispania, rulers exercised authority over Roman subjects through a combination of military command, legal codification, and ecclesiastical partnerships. Churches and bishops acted as intermediaries between local populations and new kings, preserving literacy, legal administration, and civil continuity. This hybrid governance allowed successor states to function effectively while accommodating the presence of non-Roman elites, balancing continuity with adaptation. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE marks the conventional endpoint of Western Roman imperial rule, yet administrative structures persisted in multiple regions. Provincial offices, tax collection, and judicial functions continued under local authorities, often adapting Roman bureaucratic templates to new political realities. For instance, Gaul maintained a system of civitates and counts who exercised authority under the nominal recognition of kings, indicating that Roman administrative frameworks remained influential despite the absence of a Western emperor. The transformation of power during this period illustrates the adaptive capacity of both migrating and settled populations. Military groups became rulers, yet they relied heavily on the institutional and cultural frameworks inherited from Rome. Archaeologists have noted continuity in urban layouts, roads, and villa settlements in former Roman provinces, supporting textual evidence that governance was localized rather than destroyed. Legal codes codifying Roman law alongside Germanic custom further demonstrate how these successor kingdoms merged administrative traditions. By the mid-5th century, Europe had entered a phase in which regional polities assumed the functions formerly centralized in Rome. Power was increasingly negotiated between local elites, military leaders, and ecclesiastical authorities. The establishment of kingdoms such as the Visigothic, Burgundian, and Vandal realms set a precedent for hybrid governance that would define early medieval political structures. Military service, legal integration, and regional administration became the mechanisms through which authority was exercised in the post-Roman West. These successor kingdoms laid the groundwork for early medieval political structures, establishing patterns of territorial control, legal continuity, and cultural interaction that would persist for centuries. By 476 CE, while the Western Roman Empire had formally ended, the social, administrative, and cultural frameworks it had created continued to shape the political landscape of Europe. Power in post-Roman Europe was built through both sword and sacrament. In the decades following the decline of Western imperial authority, the Franks emerged as a dominant force in Gaul, consolidating military conquest with strategic religious alignment to establish long-term legitimacy. The Frankish ascendancy began under the Merovingian dynasty, with Clovis I as its most notable early ruler. Clovis inherited control over a cluster of small Frankish polities in northeastern Gaul, and gradually expanded his dominion through warfare, marriage alliances, and political negotiation. Gregory of Tours' Historia Francorum provides contemporary insight into these campaigns, recording battles against the Alemanni, Visigoths, and other regional powers. Archaeological findings, including fortified settlements and weapon caches, corroborate these accounts, illustrating a military infrastructure capable of projecting authority across formerly Roman territories. By the late 5th century, Clovis had unified multiple Frankish groups, establishing a centralized royal court while maintaining relationships with local aristocrats and regional leaders. This consolidation of power relied not only on battlefield success but also on the alignment of the monarchy with emerging Christian institutions. Clovis' conversion to Nicene Christianity around 496 CE represents a critical moment in legitimizing Frankish rule. Baptized in the presence of influential bishops, Clovis secured ecclesiastical endorsement, strengthening bonds with Gallo-Roman elites who retained administrative expertise and urban networks. Legal and administrative cooperation between Frankish rulers and bishops facilitated governance across the newly acquired territories. The intersection of military conquest and religious patronage extended to lawmaking. The Lex Salica, the foundational legal code of the Salian Franks, illustrates the synthesis of customary Frankish law with Roman administrative precedent. While the code addresses personal and property disputes, it also integrates concepts of compensation and civic obligation familiar to Gallo-Roman communities. Archaeological excavations of cemeteries from this period demonstrate a blending of burial practices. Grave goods reflect both traditional Frankish martial identity and continued Roman ritual customs, highlighting cultural integration as a component of political legitimacy. Clovis' successors continued this pattern, relying on dynastic succession, military organization, and ecclesiastical partnerships to stabilize and expand their realm. The Merovingian kings maintained the practice of subdividing territories among heirs, a system that ensured continuity of the royal lineage while creating regional centers of authority. Though this often produced internal competition, it allowed the monarchy to maintain overarching legitimacy through ceremonial recognition and the backing of bishops. Evidence from administrative documents and royal charters shows that local officials continued to oversee taxation, legal enforcement, and urban administration under royal supervision, illustrating the persistence of Roman institutional frameworks within a new political context. The political strategy of integrating religion with governance extended beyond symbolic endorsement. Bishops acted as intermediaries in legal disputes, recorded transactions, and supervised infrastructure projects. Episcopal networks also facilitated the spread of literacy and bureaucratic expertise, enabling the Merovingian state to operate efficiently despite the fragmented political landscape. Architectural evidence, including the construction of churches and episcopal residences, reinforces the material presence of this dual authority, linking spiritual legitimacy directly to territorial control. Military power remained essential to maintaining and expanding Frankish influence. Fortifications along rivers and key trade routes, such as those identified in northern Gaul, illustrate strategic planning for both defense and the projection of force. Contemporary chronicles note frequent campaigns against neighboring groups, indicating that warfare was a continuous tool for consolidating authority. Yet these campaigns were complemented by negotiated alliances and integration of conquered elites, demonstrating that military conquest alone was insufficient to sustain rule over diverse populations. The synthesis of conquest, law, and religious alignment produced a durable model of governance. Clovis' reign and the early Merovingian period show that authority in post-Roman Europe depended as much on institutional adaptation as on martial success. By codifying law, cooperating with the church, and fostering cultural integration, the Frankish monarchy established mechanisms for both control and continuity in a rapidly transforming landscape. By the early 7th century, the foundations laid by Clovis and his immediate successors had transformed the Frankish realms into a cohesive political entity. This ascendancy reflected broader European patterns, wherein regional powers relied on hybrid strategies of military strength, legal codification, and religious legitimization to fill the vacuum left by Rome. The success of the Franks set the stage for the emergence of Carolingian authority in the following centuries, illustrating a continuum in the evolution of post-Roman political structures. Britain became a laboratory of post-Roman political experimentation. After the withdrawal of Roman legions in the early 5th century, the island's fragmented communities navigated a complex interplay of migration, settlement, and cultural adaptation, laying the foundations for the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. The departure of Roman forces around 410 CE left Britain without a centralized military or administrative authority. Local civitates, urban centers, and villa estates had previously relied on imperial structures for tax collection, legal adjudication, and defense. Archaeological surveys indicate a decline in urban maintenance and a reduction in public infrastructure, particularly in cities such as Verulamium and Londinium. In this context, incoming groups from Northern Europe, collectively referred to as Anglo-Saxons, established new settlements across eastern and southern Britain. Material evidence, including pottery styles, weapon deposits, and settlement layouts, demonstrates a gradual rather than abrupt integration of these communities into the existing landscape. These migratory groups often settled through negotiated arrangements with local British elites, suggesting a complex interplay of coercion and cooperation. The expansion of early Anglo-Saxon settlements was not uniform. Cemeteries at sites such as Sutton who illustrate both continuity and innovation. Burials with grave goods, including weapons, jewelry, and imported items, reveal hierarchical structures and emerging kingship, while the presence of Roman-style artifacts indicates sustained cultural interaction with residual Romano-British populations. This evidence underscores the hybrid character of early Anglo-Saxon polities, in which incoming leaders adapted inherited administrative models to new territorial contexts. The formation of kingdoms such as Kent, Wessex, and Northumbria reflected the consolidation of power around regional elites. Early law codes, including the laws of Ethelbert, c. 602 CE, codified compensation, social hierarchy, and legal obligations, integrating customary practices with residual Roman legal concepts. These codes reveal the dual function of early kingship, enforcing justice while maintaining loyalty among diverse populations. Kings relied on personal retinues of warriors, local aristocracies, and ecclesiastical authorities to administer their territories effectively, illustrating a combination of military, legal, and religious governance. Christianity, which had existed in Roman Britain, largely declined during the 5th century but re-entered the island through Irish and Roman missions during the 6th and 7th centuries. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites and churches, along with hagiographical sources, demonstrates the establishment of ecclesiastical networks that supported literacy, education, and record-keeping. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People documents the roles of missionaries, such as Augustine of Canterbury in the south and Irish monks in the north, showing how religious institutions reinforced royal authority and provided continuity with wider European Christian networks. The consolidation of power in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was often contingent on both martial capacity and political negotiation. Fortified enclosures, such as those excavated at Yevering and other northern sites, indicate organized defensive strategies, while evidence of trade, imports of wine, jewelry, and coins, suggests that these kingdoms maintained economic connections with continental Europe. Military campaigns and alliances, recorded in chronicles and annals, reinforced territorial control and facilitated the integration of newly settled populations, demonstrating that authority depended on both force and diplomacy. Urban continuity was limited but strategically significant. Roman towns often persisted as administrative or ecclesiastical centers, though their scale was reduced. Archaeological layers at Winchester, Canterbury, and York reveal both the reuse of Roman roads and walls and adaptations to new settlement patterns, reflecting the pragmatic integration of former imperial infrastructure into emerging kingdoms. Coin hoards, including early ciadas, further indicate the emergence of localized economic systems linked to these centers of power. By the end of the 7th century, Anglo-Saxon England had developed a patchwork of kingdoms with codified legal systems, organized aristocracies, and ecclesiastical networks. These kingdoms exemplify the broader European trend of post-Roman state formation, wherein regional rulers negotiated continuity and change, integrating Roman administrative templates with indigenous and migratory social structures. Legal codification, fortified settlements, and ecclesiastical patronage collectively enabled the stabilization of authority in a formerly fragmented landscape. Parallel developments occurred across continental Europe. While the Merovingians consolidated power in Gaul and the Visigoths established hybrid governance in Hispania, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain illustrated a similar dynamic. Localized authority built on a combination of military strength, law, and religious legitimacy. This insular experimentation in state formation would serve as a template for future consolidation under later dynasties, including the emergence of Wessex as the dominant political force in the 9th and 10th centuries. By the mid-8th century, royal power in Francia had already changed hands in practice. While Merovingian kings retained formal titles, the true levers of authority rested with the mayors of the palace, most notably the Pippinid family, whose military and administrative control increasingly dictated the trajectory of the Frankish realms. The displacement of Merovingian authority was a gradual process, reflecting systemic shifts rather than a sudden coup. After the Battle of Tertry in 687 CE, Charles Martel emerged as the dominant military figure within the Frankish polity. Contemporary chronicles, including the Annals Mettenses Prioris, describe Martel's campaigns against Neustria and other rivals as decisive, consolidating territorial control under his command. Archaeological evidence from fortifications and battlefield sites in northern Gaul corroborates these accounts, demonstrating a concentration of military resources aligned with Carolingian leadership. Over time, the Pippinid family accrued unprecedented influence, exercising both fiscal oversight and judicial authority traditionally associated with kingship. A critical element of Carolingian consolidation was the reorganization of military resources. Charles Martel implemented reforms that redistributed church lands to fund cavalry forces, providing both economic support and logistical stability for long-term campaigns. These measures, documented in later legal and ecclesiastical texts, strengthened the capacity of the Carolingians to mobilize troops while reinforcing ties with the church. Redistribution of land also secured loyalty among local elites, creating a network of dependencies that extended beyond martial obligation to encompass fiscal and administrative control. The weakening of Merovingian kingship was further facilitated by the ceremonial and symbolic nature of royal authority. Childeric III and his predecessors retained titles and regalia but exercised minimal political influence. Contemporary Frankish chronicles illustrate that key decisions, ranging from military campaigns to land grants, were made by mayors of the palace, signaling the practical transfer of power. The Merovingians' continued presence as figurehead monarchs allowed for continuity in royal symbolism, while the Carolingians exercised the substantive functions of governance. Ecclesiastical alignment played a decisive role in legitimizing the Carolingian transition. The relationship between Charles Martel and the Church, though at times pragmatic, established a precedent for ecclesiastical endorsement of secular authority. By securing papal recognition, Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son, was able to formally depose Childeric III in 751 CE. The papal sanction, documented in the Liber Pontificalis and related correspondence, transformed what had been a practical transfer of power into a dynastic legitimacy grounded in religious authority. This integration of spiritual endorsement with secular governance illustrates the dual mechanisms underpinning early medieval rulership. Administrative and fiscal practices reinforced this consolidation. The Carolingians retained and adapted elements of Merovingian governance, including oversight of regional counts, legal adjudication, and the collection of tribute. Royal charters and capitularies from the mid-8th century document the distribution of privileges, tax collection, and military obligations across territories under Carolingian control. These administrative measures enabled a coherent projection of authority despite the fragmentation and decentralization characteristic of earlier Merovingian rule. The interplay between military strength, land redistribution, and ecclesiastical support exemplifies the systematic approach by which the Carolingians transformed practical governance. Charles Martel's consolidation did not eliminate opposition entirely but created a durable framework in which the monarchy's functions could be exercised by the family controlling military, fiscal, and legal levers. This framework allowed the Carolingians to stabilize Francia, integrate diverse regional elites, and prepare the state for expansion and centralization in subsequent decades. By the mid-8th century, the foundation of Carolingian rule had been firmly established. Power no longer resided in ceremonial kingship alone but in the coordinated exercise of military command, administrative oversight, and ecclesiastical endorsement. The deposition of Childeric III and the coronation of Pepin the Short in 751 CE formalized what had long been a practical reality, marking the beginning of a dynastic system that combined symbolic legitimacy with institutional control. This consolidation enabled an unprecedented expansion of Frankish authority, setting the stage for the empire-building campaigns of Pepin's successors and, eventually, Charlemagne. The structural changes of this period demonstrate that political transformation in early medieval Europe relied as much on strategic adaptation of institutions and networks as on military conquest. Empire emerged not from sudden proclamation, but sustained administration. Charlemagne's consolidation of power in the late 8th and early 9th centuries demonstrates how systematic governance, military organization, and legal reform enabled the transformation of a regional kingdom into a pan-European imperial structure. Charlemagne inherited the Carolingian realm in 768 CE, following the death of Pepin the Short. At that time, Francia encompassed diverse territories with varying degrees of integration, from the core regions of Neustria and Austrasia to peripheral areas such as Bavaria and Lombardy. Early in his reign, Charlemagne pursued both military campaigns and administrative reforms to assert control over these disparate regions. Contemporary sources, including the Royal Frankish Annals, document successive campaigns against the Saxons, Lombards, and Avars, demonstrating a combination of martial authority and political negotiation that extended Frankish dominance across Western Europe. Military organization under Charlemagne reflected both continuity and adaptation. Troops were raised through the levy system, with local lords responsible for providing armed men proportional to the size of their holdings. Archaeological evidence, including fortified encampments in Saxony and Bavaria, illustrates the logistical infrastructure required for sustained campaigns. Redistribution of land and titles rewarded loyal vassals while ensuring that military obligations remained embedded in the social hierarchy. These campaigns were not purely expansionist. They also reinforced internal cohesion by integrating newly conquered elites into the Carolingian political network. Administration relied on the standardization of governance across the empire. Capitularies, royal decrees covering judicial, fiscal, and ecclesiastical matters, provided uniform guidelines for officials, bridging regional differences in law and custom. Charlemagne maintained authority through itinerancy, traveling with his court across the empire to oversee local governance directly. This strategy, recorded in the Annals Regni Francorum, allowed the emperor to enforce capitular directives while personally adjudicating disputes, thereby linking central authority with local administration. Legal reform reinforced imperial cohesion. Charlemagne codified existing Frankish law, adapted Roman legal principles, and collaborated with ecclesiastical authorities to regulate moral and social norms. The integration of canon law into governance, as seen in capitularies addressing clerical conduct and lay obligations, exemplified the alliance between secular and religious authority. These measures strengthened legitimacy and facilitated consistent administration over territories with diverse populations and cultural traditions. Charlemagne's reign also emphasized symbolic and physical manifestations of imperial authority. Archaeological investigations at Aachen reveal a complex of palaces, chapels, and audience halls reflecting centralized planning and architectural sophistication. The Palatine Chapel, in particular, served both religious and administrative functions, demonstrating how ceremonial spaces reinforced political hierarchy. Artistic programs, including illuminated manuscripts and sculptural decoration, further communicated the emperor's reach and legitimacy throughout the empire. The coronation of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III in 800 CE formalized his role as emperor, signaling the revival of imperial authority in the West. While this event has often been portrayed as the foundation of a new empire, evidence indicates that much of the underlying administrative and military framework had already been established. The coronation confirmed existing structures rather than creating them, illustrating how legitimacy derived as much from sustained governance and institutional control as from ceremonial recognition. Cultural and intellectual cohesion accompanied administrative and military consolidation. Charlemagne sponsored educational initiatives, including the promotion of literacy among clergy and palace officials, the preservation of classical texts, and the standardization of script through the development of Carolingian minuscule. Scholars such as Alcuin of York provided expertise in theology, law, and administration, reinforcing a unified cultural framework that complemented political authority. These initiatives facilitated communication, record-keeping, and governance across vast and linguistically diverse territories. The expansion of Frankish authority under Charlemagne demonstrates the interplay of military power, legal standardization, administrative oversight, and cultural patronage. By combining these elements, the emperor created a durable model of empire capable of managing complex political, economic, and social systems. Archaeological, textual, and numismatic evidence collectively supports the view that Charlemagne's rule relied on careful coordination and institutional innovation rather than sudden conquest alone. By the time of Charlemagne's death in 814 CE, the Carolingian Empire encompassed a vast territory stretching from the Iberian Marches to the Elbe and from the North Sea to central Italy. Military conquests, administrative reforms, and ecclesiastical alignment had produced a stable and cohesive imperial structure. This scale of governance, unprecedented in the post-Roman West, required cultural and intellectual cohesion to maintain legitimacy, demonstrating that enduring authority depended on systematic integration rather than symbolic ceremony alone. The imperial scale achieved under Charlemagne established patterns of governance, legal codification, and cultural integration that would influence European polities for centuries. Imperial structures, including the coordination of military, fiscal, and ecclesiastical authority, persisted in modified forms long after his reign, illustrating the lasting imprint of Carolingian statecraft on the medieval world. Power in medieval Europe became increasingly territorial and personal. As central authority weakened following the decline of the Carolingian Empire, political control shifted to regional magnates, whose influence was grounded in landholding, military command, and judicial prerogatives. The disintegration of Carolingian central authority in the early 10th century created a political landscape characterized by decentralization. Royal power, once exercised through itinerant kingship and administrative oversight, diminished significantly. Contemporary charters from West Francia, East Francia, and Italy reveal that counts, dukes, and castellans frequently acted autonomously, granting land, adjudicating disputes, and collecting taxes independently of the monarchy. Legal documents indicate that these regional rulers exercised banal authority, jurisdiction over justice, levies, and public duties, effectively privatizing functions that had previously been centralized under Carolingian governance. Fortified settlements emerged as both symbols and instruments of localized power. Archaeological surveys demonstrate the proliferation of motte and bailey castles, stone keeps, and fortified manorial centers throughout France, Germany, and northern Italy. These constructions were often sited to control trade routes, river crossings, and arable land, reflecting the dual necessity of defense and territorial administration. The rise of fortifications also responded to external threats. Viking raids along the Seine, Loire, and North Sea coasts, as well as Magyar incursions in Central Europe, incentivized regional rulers to consolidate military and judicial authority within defensible centers. Documentary evidence further illustrates the privatization of justice and landholding. Charters and diplomas record the grant of judicial rights, iudicium, toll collection, and the management of local resources by magnates and ecclesiastical institutions. In many cases, royal intervention was minimal or nominal, highlighting the shift from a hierarchical, centralized model to a network of semi-independent territorial authorities. For instance, counts in northern France could issue judgments and exact fines within their territories without reference to the crown, reinforcing their practical autonomy. The fragmentation of authority also reshaped relationships between lords and subordinates. Fealty and service became personal obligations, tied to land tenure rather than abstract institutions. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements shows patterns of dispersed lordly estates and dependent peasant holdings, indicating that control over agricultural production was central to political power. These estates often included fortified residences for the lord and associated buildings for craftsmen or retainers, illustrating the integration of military, judicial, and economic functions within a localized framework. Military obligations became a critical component of localized authority. Lords were expected to provide troops for defense and offensive operations, drawing from their vassals or retinues. The proliferation of private fortifications and small-scale garrisons reflects the strategic necessity of regional defense in the absence of a centralized royal army. Chroniclers, including Widukind of Corvey and Flodord of Reims, document both Viking and Magyar incursions, showing that survival depended on local organization and rapid mobilization, rather than reliance on distant kings. The decentralization of power also fostered complex interactions between secular and ecclesiastical authorities. Monasteries and bishoprics often exercised their own jurisdiction over land and peasants, granting privileges and collecting rents independently. Charters frequently record agreements between secular lords and ecclesiastical institutions, demonstrating negotiation and compromise as essential mechanisms for maintaining authority and ensuring resource management. These arrangements reinforced the fragmented yet interdependent nature of political control during the 10th century. The cumulative effect of territorialized authority was the emergence of a multi-layered system of governance. Kings retained nominal recognition, often performing ceremonial functions and granting titles, but effective control relied on the cooperation or acquiescence of regional magnates. Archaeological evidence indicates continuity of infrastructure from the Carolingian period, yet management and protection of these assets increasingly fell to local lords, reflecting a redistribution of institutional capacity from centralized to regional hands. By the close of the 10th century, the political landscape of Europe had become distinctly decentralized. Authority was exercised through personal bonds, territorial control, and localized military capacity rather than centralized bureaucracy. Counts, dukes, and castellans mediated justice, organized defense, and managed production, effectively filling the vacuum left by declining royal oversight. These conditions reshaped social and economic relationships, establishing the structural framework for the feudal arrangements that would dominate the 11th and 12th centuries. These patterns of localized authority set the stage for the development of feudal hierarchies, codified obligations, and the intertwining of military and economic power that would define European society during the High Middle Ages. Agriculture determined the rhythms of medieval life. In the centuries following the Carolingian decline, the manorial system structured both economic production and social relations, providing a stable foundation for local communities in a fragmented political landscape. The manorial system emerged as the principal framework through which land was managed, labor organized, and resources distributed. Estates, or manors, combined arable land, pastures, woodland, and infrastructure under the oversight of a lord or ecclesiastical institution. Archaeological surveys of rural settlements in France, England and Germany reveal evidence of nucleated villages surrounded by open field systems, indicating coordinated patterns of cultivation and resource use. Documentary sources, including estate records, charters, and account rolls, describe obligations of peasants, villeins, and borders to provide labor, produce, or rent in exchange for protection and access to land. Peasant labor was essential to the functioning of manors. Villagers performed a combination of personal plots and compulsory work on domain lands directly controlled by the lord. Field surveys and reconstructed agricultural layouts demonstrate that labor obligations could be seasonal, reflecting the requirements of plowing, sowing, harvesting, and maintenance of infrastructure such as dikes and irrigation channels. Manorial records, including the Liber Horn and similar accounts, indicate a reliance on corvée labor, payments in kind, and shared responsibilities for communal tasks, showing the interdependence between lordly authority and peasant productivity. Technological developments enhanced agrarian efficiency during this period. The introduction and widespread adoption of the heavy plow, carruca, enabled deeper tillage of northern European soils, which were often heavier and clay-rich. Archaeological finds, including plowshares and ox yokes, confirm the integration of this technology into both small and large estates. Similarly, the three-field system, rotating crops between spring grains, winter grains, and fallow, improved soil fertility and increased yields. These innovations allowed manors to produce sufficient subsistence for resident populations while generating modest surpluses for local markets or rent obligations. Manorial economies were largely self-sufficient, with production oriented toward local consumption rather than long-distance trade. Archaeobotanical evidence and faunal remains indicate mixed farming, including cereals, legumes, cattle, pigs, and sheep, supplemented by woodland foraging and hunting. Estates were designed to sustain both peasant and lordly households, integrating residential, agricultural, and craft activities. Specialized production, such as mills, smithies, and dairies, further diversified economic output, demonstrating the adaptability of the manorial system to local environmental and demographic conditions. The economic structure of manorialism reinforced social hierarchy. Lords exercised judicial and fiscal authority within their estates, including the regulation of markets, tolls, and fines. Estate records indicate detailed oversight of obligations, including labor schedules, crop allocations, and dues for use of mills, ovens, and pastures. Peasant dependence on access to land and protection created a structured network of obligations, in which economic activity was inseparable from social subordination. Archaeological evidence, including fortified manor houses and boundary ditches, reflects both the material and symbolic assertion of lordly authority over the rural population. Regional variations influenced the development of manorial practices. In northern France and England, estates often consisted of dispersed holdings with open field systems, while in southern Europe, smaller enclosed plots and intensive viticulture or olive cultivation predominated. Documentary evidence, such as the Domesday Book in England, provides quantitative data on estate size, population, and resources, demonstrating both continuity and adaptation of manorial structures across diverse landscapes. Manorial lords also maintained connections with broader political and ecclesiastical networks. Lords could provide military service to regional counts or dukes, while monasteries controlled extensive estates that incorporated similar labor and production arrangements. Charters recording grants to religious institutions illustrate that manorial management served both secular and ecclesiastical authorities, embedding local economic structures within wider political and spiritual hierarchies. The cumulative effect of manorial organization was the creation of a stable, localized economy that supported population growth, social order, and hierarchical governance. By the 11th century, manorialism had become the defining economic system of medieval Europe, integrating technological innovation, agrarian productivity, and social obligation. Its resilience reflected the adaptability of local communities to environmental, political, and demographic pressures. Economic dependence reinforced social hierarchy by linking labor, production, and legal obligations. Peasants relied on access to land for subsistence, while lords and ecclesiastical institutions exercised authority through control of resources and enforcement of obligations. This relationship structured rural life, dictated settlement patterns, and influenced broader patterns of trade, taxation, and regional governance. The manorial system thus provided both the material foundation and social framework for the emerging feudal order. Europe's economy expanded from its fields outward. Between the 11th and 12th centuries, demographic recovery and agricultural innovation transformed the rural landscape, laying the foundation for urban revival and regional trade networks. Population growth in this period was closely linked to climatic stability and technological adaptation. The relatively mild and wet conditions of the medieval climate anomaly, c. 950 to 1250 CE, extended the growing season across much of Western and Central Europe, enabling higher crop yields and more reliable subsistence. Archaeobotanical analysis, including pollen cores and cereal grain remains, demonstrates an expansion of arable land into previously marginal areas such as forested uplands and marshes. Settlement archaeology corroborates this evidence. New villages and hamlets appeared along cleared forest edges and drained wetlands, indicating systematic exploitation of previously underutilized resources. Agricultural expansion was facilitated by technological innovations. The widespread adoption of the heavy plow karuka in northern Europe, combined with iron-tipped plowshares and improved harnessing techniques for oxen, allowed deeper tillage of heavy soils. The three-field system, rotating winter grains, spring crops, and fallow land, further increased yields while maintaining soil fertility. Estate records, including manorial account rolls and ecclesiastical registers, indicate both higher productivity and greater regularity of harvests. These innovations contributed directly to population growth by reducing famine risk and sustaining larger communities. Intensified land use also produced social and economic restructuring. New settlements often included nucleated villages clustered around manorial centers, while open-field systems organized shared arable plots. Archaeological evidence from northern France, England, and the Rhineland demonstrates long, narrow field strips demarcated by drainage ditches or hedgerows. These layouts enabled coordinated cultivation and allowed lords or ecclesiastical authorities to extract labor obligations efficiently. The integration of peasant labor into systematic production reinforced social hierarchies while supporting estate economies capable of surplus generation. Demographic growth was uneven, reflecting regional variation in soil fertility, climate, and political stability. In fertile regions such as the Paris Basin, Flanders, and the Po Valley, village expansion and field intensification were rapid, while upland or frontier areas exhibited slower growth. Settlement patterns reveal adaptive strategies. Small subsidiary hamlets emerged to exploit marginal lands, while manorial centers oversaw both agricultural production and local judicial administration. Estate records indicate that lords increasingly relied on precise labor allocation, dues, and tenant obligations to maximize output, illustrating the interdependence of population density and institutional control. The expansion of cultivated land had ecological as well as economic implications. Deforestation and drainage of wetlands created arable and pasture areas but required labor-intensive maintenance. Archaeobotanical analysis shows increases in cereal pollen, alongside declines in woodland species, confirming human-driven landscape transformation. These modifications facilitated more intensive grazing, cereal cultivation, and horticulture, which in turn supported larger livestock populations and diversified diets. Material evidence, including plow marks, storage pits, and granaries, illustrates the scale of investment necessary to sustain these demographic and agricultural gains. Population growth was closely linked to urban and commercial development. As rural productivity increased, surpluses became available for trade and taxation. Monasteries, manors, and emerging towns functioned as centers for storage, redistribution, and exchange. Estate records document the levying of rents in grain and livestock, which could be sold or exported to nearby markets, reinforcing the feedback loop between agricultural output and local prosperity. The surplus also enabled the formation of specialized crafts, workshops, and milling operations, which supported both local consumption and emerging urban economies. Migration and colonization of frontier regions contributed further to demographic expansion. Nobles and ecclesiastical institutions encouraged settlement in forested, upland, and marshland areas, often granting temporary exemptions from dues or providing tools and seed. Archaeological surveys in northern Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of eastern France reveal planned village layouts, including standardized house plots and field arrangements, demonstrating coordinated expansion efforts. Pollen analysis confirms large-scale forest clearance and the establishment of arable land in previously wooded areas, highlighting both human agency and environmental adaptation. The demographic and agricultural expansion of this period had cascading economic consequences. Surplus production supported trade in grain, livestock, and specialty products, while increased population density stimulated demand for tools, textiles, and other goods. These conditions provided the material basis for urban growth, merchant networks, and craft specialization. Documentary evidence from market charters, toll registers, and ecclesiastical accounts illustrates the rising volume of exchange, connecting rural productivity directly with urban revival. By the late 12th century, Europe had entered a phase of sustained population growth and intensified land use. Settlements expanded geographically, production systems became more efficient, and rural communities supported higher densities. These developments reshaped the social and economic fabric, establishing the foundation for market economies, urban centers, and regional trade networks. Demography, technology, and land management were interdependent, collectively driving the transformation of Western Europe's agrarian landscape. Surplus production encouraged trade, connecting villages, manors, and towns into broader networks of exchange. The availability of excess grain, livestock, and artisanal goods allowed merchants to operate in regional markets, fostering the revival of long-distance commerce and creating the economic conditions for urban growth. Agricultural expansion thus not only supported demographic recovery but also acted as a structural catalyst for the urban and commercial revival that would define the High Middle Ages. Commerce reconnected Europe to wider exchange systems. Between the 11th and 12th centuries, trade networks, both regional and transcontinental, facilitated the circulation of goods, currency, and information, linking rural productivity with the revival of towns and markets. Trade in medieval Europe was multifaceted, encompassing Mediterranean, Atlantic, and northern routes. In the south, Italian city-states such as Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established maritime networks connecting the Italian peninsula to Byzantium, the Levant, and North Africa. Archaeological evidence, including imported ceramics, amphory, and coinage, indicates the scale of Mediterranean exchange. Northern Europe developed complementary networks along rivers and coastlines, with the Low Countries, northern Germany, and Scandinavia participating in long-distance commerce. The Hanseatic League, emerging toward the 12th century, codified trade practices between towns such as Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bruges, creating durable connections for the circulation of timber, furs, grain, and other commodities. Coinage played a central role in facilitating exchange. Hoards discovered across England, France, and Germany reveal the circulation of silver pennies and other minted currency, while mint records demonstrate increased production in response to economic growth. Numismatic evidence, including denier and seat coins, indicates both regional standardization and the integration of international trade, as foreign coinage circulated alongside local issues. Coin hoards in riverine and urban contexts reflect not only commercial activity but also the accumulation of wealth and investment in trade infrastructure. Markets and fairs functioned as pivotal nodes in these networks. Charter records from towns across Flanders, Champagne, and the Rhineland show formalized market rights granted by local lords or bishops, with designated times and locations for trade. These gatherings facilitated both wholesale and retail exchange, connecting local producers with itinerant merchants and consumers from surrounding regions. Archaeological excavations of urban centers, including streets lined with workshops and storage pits, demonstrate the infrastructure necessary to support sustained commercial activity. The expansion of trade was directly linked to agricultural surplus. Grain, livestock, wool, and timber produced on manorial and monastic estates could be sold or exchanged in urban markets, creating a feedback loop in which rural productivity fueled urban growth, and urban demand incentivized further agricultural intensification. Documentary evidence from estate accounts, toll registers, and merchant correspondence indicates that surplus production enabled both local exchange and long-distance trade, embedding villages and towns into broader economic networks. Maritime trade fostered technological and organizational innovation. Ports such as Venice, Marseille, and Bruges developed specialized docks, warehouses, and shipbuilding facilities, while river trade relied on barges and flatboats capable of transporting bulk goods. Documentary and archaeological sources indicate that these innovations supported greater volumes of commerce and enhanced the reliability of supply. Furthermore, guilds and merchant associations emerged to regulate trade standards, mediate disputes, and provide collective protection, demonstrating the institutionalization of economic activity. The movement of goods also facilitated the transmission of knowledge, skills, and cultural practices. Italian merchants brought fabrics, spices, and knowledge of Mediterranean navigation, while northern merchants distributed timber, grain, and metalwork. Correspondence and account books show contractual arrangements between distant trading partners, illustrating that commercial networks operated not only through physical exchange but also through structured legal and financial systems. These connections integrated diverse regions of Europe into a wider economic and cultural sphere. Urban centers, closely tied to trade, became hubs of both economic and political authority. Towns such as Lübeck, Bruges, and Paris expanded in size and population, with urban charters granting rights to hold markets, self-govern, and collect tolls. Archaeological evidence, including coin finds, storage facilities, and workshops, demonstrates a high level of commercial activity and a concentration of wealth. The growth of towns encouraged specialization in crafts, long-distance trade, and financial instruments, reinforcing the interdependence of rural production, trade networks, and urban development. Trade networks also connected Europe to the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds, providing access to luxury goods and raw materials previously unavailable on the continent. Venetian and Genoese merchants imported silk, spices, and glassware, while northern merchants exchanged timber, furs, and amber. Numismatic and documentary evidence confirms the use of both local and foreign currency, reflecting the integration of European commerce into a wider system of exchange that extended from the North Sea to the Levant. By the late 12th century, these trade networks had transformed the European economy. Surplus production, monetary circulation, and market specialization facilitated urban growth, economic diversification, and institutional innovation. The revival of commerce created a dynamic environment in which towns, estates, and regions became increasingly interdependent, providing the foundation for the political, social, and economic transformations of the High Middle Ages. Trade fostered urban growth, establishing towns as centers of economic activity, legal authority, and cultural exchange. The interconnection of agricultural surplus, regional markets, and long-distance trade created the material and institutional basis for the urban revival, linking the countryside to increasingly sophisticated networks of production, exchange, and governance. War became framed as spiritual obligation. In the High Middle Ages, European military campaigns were increasingly justified by religious authority, blending papal sanction, social hierarchy, and martial organization to mobilize unprecedented numbers of combatants for distant conflicts. The crusading movement emerged from the convergence of religious ideology, political ambition, and social transformation. In 1095, Pope Urban II's call at Clermont urged Western Christendom to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, framing participation as an act of penance with spiritual rewards. Chronicles such as Fulcher of Chartres and Albert of Aachen document the immediate enthusiasm across France, Germany, and Italy, illustrating both clerical influence and the appeal of sanctioned violence. The ideological framing of crusading as militia Christi, soldiers of Christ, provided moral justification for armed mobilization, embedding spiritual purpose within martial activity. Papal authority underpinned this mobilization. Decrees and letters, including Urban II's speeches and subsequent papal bulls, established ecclesiastical oversight of recruitment, indulgences, and logistics. Church hierarchy functioned as both ideological propagator and administrative coordinator. Local bishops and abbots organized recruitment drives, provided pastoral guidance, and oversaw the collection of tithes to fund expeditions. The integration of religious sanction with material preparation demonstrates the institutional capacity of the papacy to influence both secular and clerical actors. The organization of crusading forces required substantial logistical coordination. Feudal obligations, private retinues, and urban levies combined to form armies capable of sustained campaigns over hundreds of kilometers. Contemporary chronicles, supported by archaeological evidence of fortified encampments and transport depots in the Rhineland, the Adriatic, and the Levant, illustrate the scale of provisioning required. These campaigns relied on a mixture of professional knights, vassal contingents, and peasant participants, reflecting a flexible yet hierarchical command structure anchored in feudal ties. Economic preparation was critical for sustaining participation. Crusaders relied on the sale or mortgaging of estates, the collection of funds through ecclesiastical tithes, and the organization of transport and supply networks. Numismatic evidence and coin hoards indicate the use of regional currency to finance logistics, while port excavations in Venice and Marseille document the shipment of troops, horses, and material across the Mediterranean. These measures illustrate the integration of local economies into transregional military efforts, revealing the financial sophistication underlying crusading campaigns. Material culture and battlefield archaeology provide further insight into crusading mobilization. Excavations at sites such as Antioch, Acre, and Jerusalem reveal fortifications, siege works, and weaponry consistent with sustained campaigns. Artifacts including chainmail, crossbow components, and horse harnesses indicate both technological adaptation and standardization of martial equipment. Combined with contemporary chronicles, these sources document the practical realities of projecting force across diverse terrains and political landscapes, highlighting the logistical and technological underpinnings of crusading. Crusading ideology extended beyond military mobilization to encompass social cohesion and identity. Participants were motivated not only by religious obligation but also by the opportunity to enhance prestige, secure political alliances, and acquire wealth. Papal indulgences provided spiritual incentives, while feudal hierarchies facilitated recruitment through personal obligation and patronage networks. This combination of spiritual, social, and material incentives illustrates the multidimensional character of crusading as a phenomenon shaping European society. The impact of crusading on European political structures was significant. Nobles, princes, and monarchs participated selectively, balancing local governance with obligations abroad. Chronicles indicate that participation often enhanced the authority of leaders who successfully mobilized troops, negotiated logistics, and maintained discipline. Ecclesiastical authorities gained influence through oversight of recruitment, fundraising, and spiritual sanction, reinforcing the interplay between secular and religious power. These dynamics contributed to evolving models of authority in both urban and rural contexts. Crusading also facilitated cross-cultural contact and exchange. European armies interacted with Byzantine, Muslim, and Armenian polities, acquiring knowledge of fortification techniques, logistics, and regional governance. Archaeological evidence, including imported ceramics, coins, and architectural influence, reflects both the movement of goods and the diffusion of technological and artistic practices. The exposure of European elites to Eastern Mediterranean networks contributed indirectly to the later expansion of trade, urban growth, and intellectual exchange, linking military mobilization with broader social and economic transformation. Chronicles document not only the major campaigns to Jerusalem but also subsidiary expeditions and military orders, such as the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, which institutionalized martial and religious functions. These organizations maintained permanent infrastructure in the Levant, managed estates in Europe, and codified rules combining religious discipline with military service. Their presence illustrates the enduring institutional consequences of crusading, extending the influence of religious military ideology across both Mediterranean and European landscapes. The sustainability of crusading efforts relied on careful coordination between ideological, military, and economic frameworks. Indulgences and papal sanction provided motivation, while feudal and civic structures enabled recruitment, provisioning, and command. Material culture confirms the integration of technological and logistical capacities, from siege equipment to supply transport. Together, these elements demonstrate that the crusading movement was not a spontaneous phenomenon but a structured enterprise underpinned by systemic organization across multiple domains. By the late 13th century, crusading campaigns had extended beyond the eastern Mediterranean, influencing political, military, and religious developments in Iberia, the Baltic, and the eastern frontiers of Christendom. The mobilization of men, resources, and ideology in the name of religious obligation reshaped European society, leaving enduring institutions, networks, and patterns of authority. Crusading illustrates how martial enterprise, religious sanction, and social hierarchy intersected to produce large-scale, trans-regional activity, setting precedents for later medieval warfare, diplomacy, and cross-cultural engagement. Conflict extended beyond the eastern Mediterranean, establishing a model of religiously justified expansion that would shape political and military strategies across Europe for centuries. The organizational, ideological, and material systems developed to support the Crusades created enduring structures of mobilization, administration, and cultural exchange that influenced subsequent medieval European developments. Warfare reshaped landscapes and lordship. In the High Middle Ages, the evolution of castles, cavalry tactics, and siege technology transformed not only military strategy but also the organization of power across Europe. The proliferation of castles during this period reflects both defensive necessity and the assertion of territorial authority. Archaeological surveys across France, England, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula reveal a sharp increase in fortified sites between the 11th and 13th centuries. Motte and bailey constructions, often sited on elevated terrain or at river crossings, were quickly erected to control strategic points. Later, stone keeps and concentric fortifications emerged, indicating investment in durable military infrastructure. These structures served multiple purposes, as defensive strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of lordly authority, integrating martial and political functions within the landscape. Castle construction was closely linked to feudal obligations and social hierarchy. Lords, both secular and ecclesiastical, leveraged the labor of vassals and peasants to build fortifications, reflecting the interdependence of military, economic, and social structures. Documentary evidence, including royal charters and feudal contracts, confirms that construction often involved detailed agreements regarding labor, materials, and defense responsibilities. The density of fortifications in frontier regions such as Normandy, the Rhineland, and the Iberian Marches demonstrates the strategic role of castles in consolidating territorial control while protecting populations from raiders, rival lords, or external armies. Cavalry emerged as the dominant arm of European warfare, reshaping both battlefield tactics and social organization. The development of mounted knights, heavily armored and trained from adolescence, required significant resources, including war horses, armor, and specialized weaponry. Archaeological finds of chainmail, spurs, stirrups, and lance fragments demonstrate the increasing technical sophistication of mounted combat. Cavalry effectiveness depended on both individual skill and coordinated deployment, reinforcing the importance of hierarchical command structures within feudal levies. Feudal obligations underpinned the recruitment and organization of armies. Lords provided knights and retainers in exchange for land tenure, military service, and fealty, while peasants supplied logistical support. Chronicles such as William of Tyre and Orderic Vitali's document campaigns in France, Italy, and the Crusader states, illustrating the integration of local levies into larger expeditionary forces. Military organization relied on both permanent garrisons in castles and temporary mustering of feudal contingents, demonstrating the dual role of defensive and offensive structures in sustaining authority. Siege technology evolved in response to increasingly fortified positions. The development of traction trebuchets, counterweight siege engines, and battering rams enabled attackers to breach stone walls that previously resisted conventional assault. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Château Gallard in Normandy and Croc de Chevaliers in the Levant confirm both the sophistication of fortifications and the variety of siege implements employed against them. Siege warfare demanded logistical planning, engineering knowledge, and sustained manpower, reflecting the complex interplay of technology, strategy, and social organization. Castles and fortifications also influenced settlement patterns and economic activity. Villages frequently developed around fortified sites, providing labor, provisioning, and protection. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that markets, workshops, and storage facilities often clustered near castles, illustrating the integration of military infrastructure with local governance and economic production. Fortifications enabled lords to project authority across wider territories, enforce feudal obligations, and regulate trade, reinforcing both social hierarchy and territorial control. The refinement of knightly warfare influenced broader political and military developments. Mounted, heavily armored cavalry became decisive in open-field engagements, while infantry adapted to complement or counter mounted forces. Chronicles of battles such as Hastings, 1066, and the campaigns in southern Italy reveal the tactical importance of cavalry charges, flanking maneuvers, and combined arms, demonstrating the codification of martial knowledge into structured strategy. These developments reinforced the social and economic importance of the knightly class, whose maintenance required both agrarian surplus and feudal obligations. Archaeological evidence supports the material basis of these transformations. Weapon deposits, horse burials, and armory caches reflect both the scale and organization of military preparation. Excavated fortifications show iterative improvements over time, including thicker walls, towers, gatehouses, and moats, demonstrating adaptive responses to emerging siege techniques. These findings confirm that technological innovation and architectural sophistication were central to maintaining military superiority and territorial control. Siegecraft also had social and economic dimensions. Besieged populations relied on stored provisions, while attackers required sustained supply lines and engineering resources. Charters and chronicles document requisitions of food, labor, and materials to support campaigns, illustrating the integration of military operations with local economies. The interplay of logistical management, fortification design, and combat strategy demonstrates the systemic nature of feudal warfare. Military success depended not only on skill but also on coordination across social, economic, and technological spheres. By the late 13th century, the density of castles, the prominence of cavalry, and the sophistication of siege technology had transformed both the European battlefield and the political landscape. Fortifications structured territorial authority, cavalry shaped the hierarchy of martial power, and siegecraft demanded coordination across multiple levels of society. Together, these elements reinforced feudal obligations, defined lordship, and enabled both defensive resilience and offensive projection. Expansion continued along Europe's frontiers, from the Iberian Marches and Baltic regions to southern Italy and the Levant, reflecting the adaptability of these military structures and practices. Warfare was no longer merely episodic. It was embedded in the organization of land, labor, and social hierarchy, shaping landscapes, settlements, and political networks. The innovations in fortification, cavalry, and siege technology of this period provided the foundation for territorial consolidation and the projection of power that defined late medieval European politics. States grew through paperwork as much as armies. In the 13th century, European monarchs increasingly relied on written records, bureaucratic structures, and legal codification to consolidate authority, augment taxation, and regulate justice. The consolidation of centralized monarchy in this period was evident across multiple European polities. In England, the reigns of Henry III and Edward I illustrate the growing sophistication of royal administration. Royal chancery records, including the close rolls and patent rolls, document extensive correspondence, land grants, and legal adjudications. The institutionalization of these written systems enabled monarchs to monitor local officials, enforce fiscal obligations, and maintain oversight of distant regions. Similarly, the exchequer system formalized financial management, recording taxes, fines, and feudal dues, thereby creating a reliable framework for revenue collection and state operations. In France, the Capetian monarchy under Louis VIII and Louis IX expanded administrative oversight through the use of itinerant royal justices, baillis and seneschaux, who represented the crown in local jurisdictions. Chronicles such as those of Rigord and Joinville detail the enforcement of royal authority, particularly in contested regions like Languedoc and Normandy. Written ordinances codified procedures for taxation, land tenure disputes, and criminal justice, creating a consistent legal framework that reinforced centralized control. The growth of such bureaucratic structures allowed the crown to extract revenue efficiently and enforce justice even in regions where local nobility retained significant autonomy. The Holy Roman Empire presented a more decentralized model, yet similar administrative principles were applied. Emperor Frederick II relied on charters, legal codes, and courtly itinerancy to assert authority across a fragmented network of duchies, principalities, and bishoprics. Imperial registers, including the Liber Privilegium and court records, documented privileges, taxation rights, and judicial decisions, providing a written framework to govern heterogeneous territories. While imperial control varied regionally, the reliance on documentation and formalized procedures illustrates the increasing importance of bureaucratic authority alongside military and symbolic power. Taxation became a central instrument of state building. Royal and imperial authorities codified levies on land, goods, and trade, using written records to enforce collection and monitor compliance. For example, England's tallage, aid, and scutage systems are documented in royal rolls, providing both revenue and legal precedent for financial obligations. In France, capitation taxes, feudal aids, and customs duties were carefully recorded and administered, ensuring predictable fiscal flows to the crown. These mechanisms allowed monarchs to fund both administrative structures and military campaigns, reinforcing their capacity to project authority. Legal codification complemented fiscal and administrative expansion. Written law provided a uniform reference for adjudicating disputes, regulating property, and maintaining social order. In England, the continuation of common law under Henry III and Edward I integrated local customary law into a coherent system, supported by itinerant royal justices. France developed a parallel framework, using royal ordinances and charters to regulate feudal obligations, property rights, and criminal justice. These legal structures standardized governance, reduced arbitrary enforcement, and extended royal influence into previously autonomous regions. Centralization relied not only on documentation but also on the professionalization of officials. Clerks, notaries, and administrators became essential intermediaries between monarchs and subjects, responsible for drafting charters, recording decisions, and managing accounts. Archaeological evidence from royal palaces and administrative centers, including office complexes and storage facilities, supports the material investment in bureaucratic infrastructure. The emergence of trained administrative personnel reflects the increasing complexity of governance and the integration of literacy into state structures. Monarchs also reinforced central authority through ceremonial and symbolic practices. Coronations, oaths of fealty, and public proclamations codified political hierarchies and emphasized the legitimacy of centralized rule. Contemporary chronicles and illuminated manuscripts depict these rituals, showing how symbolic performance and legal documentation worked in tandem to consolidate authority. Such measures enhanced the visibility of the monarchy while embedding administrative norms into social practice. The effectiveness of centralization depended on balancing local autonomy with royal oversight. While England and France could enforce consistent legal and fiscal systems, the Holy Roman Empire required negotiation with territorial princes, bishoprics, and free cities. Charters and privileges issued to local elites codified obligations while acknowledging traditional rights, illustrating the pragmatic adaptation of bureaucratic methods to diverse political landscapes. This balance between written authority and negotiated power allowed monarchs to extend influence without provoking widespread resistance. Institutional expansion had material and economic consequences. Efficient taxation, judicial enforcement, and legal standardization facilitated infrastructure investment, urban development, and military provisioning. Estate surveys, toll records, and market charters indicate that state capacity underpinned economic regulation, supported trade, and reinforced feudal hierarchies. Written administration thus linked governance, fiscal control, and social order in a mutually reinforcing system. By the late 13th century, centralized monarchies had matured into bureaucratic states capable of exercising authority across extensive territories. Written records, professionalized officials, standardized taxation, and codified law allowed rulers to project power effectively, even in the context of residual feudal decentralization. These institutional developments enabled states to regulate social, economic, and military activity systematically, laying the foundation for the administrative sophistication characteristic of later medieval and early modern Europe. Institutional growth required legal frameworks. The formalization of governance, fiscal systems, and judicial oversight depended upon written law and standardized procedures. As monarchs strengthened bureaucratic capacity, the interplay between administrative infrastructure and legal codification provided a durable mechanism for maintaining authority, resolving disputes, and organizing resources across increasingly complex societies. Knowledge became institutionalized. In the 13th century, European intellectual life consolidated around universities and legal scholarship, creating frameworks for standardized reasoning that reinforced both secular and ecclesiastical authority. The revival of canon and Roman law played a central role in shaping governance and administration. Legal scholars studied and interpreted texts such as Gratian's Decretum for canon law and Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis for Roman law, producing commentaries, glosses, and treatises that codified principles of governance, justice, and social order. Manuscript evidence and university lecture notes confirm the dissemination of these texts across emerging centers of learning, demonstrating the institutionalization of legal knowledge. Scholars trained in these systems advised rulers, ecclesiastical authorities, and courts, applying standardized reasoning to practical disputes. Universities became the primary hubs for this intellectual consolidation. Institutions in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford attracted students and masters from across Europe, fostering networks of expertise in theology, law, and the liberal arts. Bologna, in particular, specialized in civil and canon law, producing jurists capable of applying Roman and ecclesiastical principles to contemporary legal problems. Lecture notes, collation manuscripts, and student records indicate a rigorous methodology. Careful textual analysis, structured disputation, and systematic commentary. These practices created intellectual norms that reinforced consistency in legal interpretation and administrative practice. The study of law directly influenced state and ecclesiastical administration. Clerics and lay administrators trained in canon law implemented standardized judicial procedures, adjudicated disputes, and administered ecclesiastical courts. Similarly, jurists versed in Roman law advised monarchs on contractual obligations, property disputes, and fiscal regulation. Charters and court rolls from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire show the increasing prevalence of written procedures, appeals, and formalized documentation, reflecting the integration of scholarly legal principles into practical governance. Intellectual activity extended beyond law. Theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts were systematically taught, producing a class of educated clerics and administrators capable of articulating, recording, and enforcing policy. University curricula emphasized logical reasoning, debate, and textual exegesis, ensuring that graduates could apply analytical methods to diverse administrative and judicial contexts. The replication of these curricula across multiple European centers facilitated standardized approaches to knowledge and problem-solving, enhancing the coherence of institutional structures. Canon law, in particular, provided a framework that intertwined moral authority with legal regulation. Ecclesiastical courts adjudicated marriage disputes, tithes, heresy, and clerical misconduct, relying on systematic procedures and codified principles. Archival records, including acta from ecclesiastical tribunals, demonstrate the application of rigorous interpretive methods derived from scholastic instruction. This standardization reinforced papal authority, enabling the Church to project influence across geographically and politically diverse regions. Roman law similarly influenced secular governance. Treatises such as Accursius Glossa Ordinaria and subsequent commentaries provided interpretive tools for resolving disputes, regulating contracts, and managing property. Legal reasoning based on Roman models allowed monarchs and local lords to adjudicate cases consistently, reducing arbitrariness and reinforcing hierarchical authority. Royal court records, municipal ordinances, and charters from this period show the practical application of codified legal principles in both urban and rural contexts. Universities also fostered intellectual networks that transcended political boundaries. Scholars traveled widely to study and teach, creating standardized approaches to reasoning and textual interpretation. Correspondence between masters, lecture notes, and disputation records indicate that academic exchange reinforced consistent methodologies across Europe. This intellectual cohesion supported governance by producing a literate and trained administrative class, capable of interpreting law, recording transactions, and enforcing authority in alignment with canonical and civil principles. The institutionalization of knowledge had material and cultural effects. Libraries, scriptoria, and lecture halls became centers for manuscript production, copying, and commentary. Archaeological evidence from university sites, including writing implements, book bindings, and lecture room layouts, confirms the physical infrastructure supporting scholarly activity. These centers not only trained jurists and clerics but also created durable repositories of knowledge, ensuring the transmission of legal and intellectual frameworks across generations. By the end of the 13th century, the revival of canon and Roman law, coupled with the rise of universities, had transformed the intellectual landscape of Europe. Knowledge was no longer dispersed or informal. It was structured, taught, and standardized. Scholars served as intermediaries between abstract principles and practical application, bridging the gap between theory and governance. The integration of legal reasoning into administration, justice, and ecclesiastical oversight created systems capable of regulating increasingly complex societies. Intellectual systems reinforced authority. Legal and scholarly institutions underpinned both secular and ecclesiastical power, providing standardized tools for governance, judicial practice, and dispute resolution. Universities produced a cadre of trained professionals who applied codified knowledge to local, regional, and transregional challenges, ensuring that authority was exercised consistently, predictably, and with legitimacy. This intertwining of knowledge and power laid the groundwork for the administrative and legal sophistication characteristic of late medieval Europe. Environmental limits reasserted themselves. In the early 14th century, climatic instability and agricultural vulnerability combined to trigger widespread famine, demonstrating the fragility of medieval demographic and economic systems. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 marked a critical turning point in medieval European history. Archival evidence, including manorial account rolls, tax registers, and ecclesiastical chronicles, indicates severe crop failures across England, France, the Low Countries, and the German lands. Contemporary accounts, such as those of the chronicler Jean de Venette, describe persistent rains, late harvests, and widespread spoilage, resulting in acute shortages of bread, grain, and other staples. Archaeobotanical and pollen data confirm crop failure and reduced cereal production during these years, revealing the scale of environmental stress. Climatic factors played a central role. The onset of the so-called Little Ice Age brought cooler and wetter conditions, shortening growing seasons and increasing susceptibility to floods and soil exhaustion. Tree-ring analysis and ice core studies corroborate anomalous precipitation and temperature fluctuations in the early 14th century, providing precise environmental context for the demographic and agricultural crisis. The combination of heavy rainfall, poor harvests, and regional variation in soil fertility exacerbated food shortages, creating a cascade of social and economic pressures. The famine disproportionately affected rural communities dependent on local harvests. Estate records indicate that peasant households were often unable to meet customary obligations to lords, with payments in kind and labor disrupted by insufficient yields. Manorial accounts from England and France show arrears in rent collection and increased reliance on charitable provisions from monasteries and urban institutions. The depletion of food stocks reduced resilience to subsequent environmental and social stresses, demonstrating the interdependence of agricultural production, economic stability, and population well-being. Mortality rates increased substantially. Demographic reconstructions based on parish registers, cemetery excavations and population models indicate localized mortality spikes of 10 to 15 in some regions, with acute vulnerability among the elderly, young children, and itinerant populations. Nutritional stress weakened immunity, predisposing communities to disease and compounding the demographic impact of environmental fluctuations. Contemporary chronicles report widespread malnutrition, livestock die-off, and social unrest, linking environmental limits directly to human vulnerability. Economic consequences extended beyond immediate subsistence crises. Grain price inflation, recorded in urban and rural markets, reduced purchasing power and constrained trade. Coin hoards and mint records suggest shifts in currency circulation as households liquidated assets to secure food. Markets in cities such as Paris, Bruges, and Cologne experienced fluctuations in supply and demand, reflecting the integration of rural scarcity into regional economies. Estates and towns adapted by rationing, relocating markets, or importing food from more productive areas, demonstrating early forms of crisis management and economic flexibility. The Great Famine revealed structural vulnerabilities in both social and institutional systems. Lords and ecclesiastical authorities attempted to mitigate shortages through grain redistribution, price regulation, and emergency relief, but administrative capacity varied regionally. Legal documents and municipal ordinances indicate attempts to prevent hoarding and speculation, highlighting the role of formal governance in addressing environmental stress. The uneven effectiveness of these measures underscores the limitations of medieval institutions in coping with widespread ecological disruption. Environmental stress also reshaped demographic and migratory patterns. Evidence from settlement surveys and tax records indicates temporary depopulation in marginal agricultural zones, as peasants migrated to towns or better-resourced regions. Archaeological data, including abandoned farmsteads and altered field systems, confirm the geographic impact of famine, illustrating both local vulnerability and adaptive responses. Migration further altered labor markets, urban densities, and the distribution of wealth, linking environmental pressures to broader socioeconomic transformation. Analytical interpretation suggests that the crisis was systemic rather than episodic. Climatic instability interacted with agricultural practices, population density, and institutional capacity to produce a multifaceted stressor. For instance, reliance on cereal monocultures, marginal land cultivation, and limited storage technology amplified vulnerability. The combination of environmental data, documentary sources, and archaeological evidence demonstrates how natural fluctuations could trigger cascading social, economic, and demographic effects. By the mid-14th century, Europe remained highly sensitive to climatic variation and agricultural shortfalls. Although recovery occurred in the subsequent decades, environmental shocks exposed structural weaknesses in population distribution, food production, and institutional resilience. The Great Famine illustrates that even in a period of political and economic growth, ecological limits imposed severe constraints, foreshadowing subsequent crises that would further stress medieval European society. Disease compounded crisis, as populations weakened by malnutrition became increasingly susceptible to epidemic pathogens. The intersection of environmental stress and demographic vulnerability would culminate in the Black Death, amplifying mortality and accelerating social, economic, and institutional transformation. In the later 14th century, power shifted toward centralized states. In the late 15th century, European rulers consolidated authority through taxation, bureaucracy, and the transformation of military organization, marking the final stages of medieval political evolution. The emergence of centralized monarchies during this period was closely linked to innovations in military technology and administration. The widespread adoption of gunpowder weaponry, including handguns, bombards, and cannon, fundamentally altered the balance of power between rulers and their vassals. Sieges no longer relied solely on fortifications resistant to conventional siege engines. Castles and city walls had to be redesigned or replaced to withstand artillery. Archaeological excavations of fortifications in Burgundy, the Low Countries, and the Italian states reveal modifications such as angled bastions, thicker walls, and detached artillery platforms, illustrating rulers' adaptation to evolving military technologies. The development of standing armies complemented these technological changes. monarchs increasingly maintained professional troops under direct royal control, reducing dependence on feudal levies. Payment records, muster rolls, and payroll documents from France, Castile, and England indicate systematic recruitment, training, and provisioning of infantry and cavalry units. The professionalization of armies enhanced operational consistency, enabling rulers to project power effectively across their territories and respond rapidly to internal and external challenges. Royal taxation supported both military and administrative expansion. Fiscal reforms, including the consolidation of customs duties, excise taxes, and direct levies, generated revenue for centralized bureaucracies and standing forces. Documentary sources such as the estimates of the French taille and English 15th century subsidies show that monarchs could mobilize resources independently of local noble intermediaries. Efficient fiscal systems reduced reliance on feudal contributions, enhancing the autonomy and authority of the crown. Centralization also entailed bureaucratic innovation. Chanceries, councils, and financial offices expanded in size and scope, formalizing record-keeping, legal adjudication, and taxation. Registers from the English Exchequer, the French Chambre de Comptes, and the Spanish Contaduría illustrate the increasing reliance on written documentation to monitor revenue, enforce obligations, and adjudicate disputes. Professional clerks, trained in both law and arithmetic, ensured the accuracy and continuity of governance, creating durable institutions that underpin state authority. The combination of military, fiscal, and bureaucratic reform reinforced political centralization. Monarchs could now suppress internal rebellions more effectively, negotiate from positions of strength with external powers, and standardize governance across previously autonomous regions. Comparative examples include France under Louis XI, who relied on artillery, paid troops, and administrative networks to curtail feudal dissent, and Castile under Henry IV, whose reforms in taxation and armed forces strengthened royal prerogatives. These developments illustrate a systematic shift from feudal dependency toward centralized authority. Military transformation had direct territorial and political consequences. Artillery allowed rulers to capture fortified towns that had previously resisted royal authority, facilitating territorial consolidation. The decline of private noble fortresses as centers of independent power reduced the capacity of regional elites to challenge monarchs militarily. Archaeological evidence of abandoned or remodeled castles in central France and northern Italy confirms this trend, demonstrating that military innovation reinforced political hierarchy. Firearms and professional troops also altered battlefield dynamics. Traditional feudal cavalry charges were increasingly vulnerable to massed infantry armed with pikes and early firearms, while artillery enabled disruption of defensive positions before engagement. Chronicles of campaigns in Burgundy, Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula detail the combined use of artillery, professional infantry, and cavalry contingents, revealing the integration of technological, tactical, and organizational changes into coherent military strategy. These shifts reshaped the relationship between ruler and subject. Military and fiscal control strengthened the crown's ability to enforce law, collect revenue, and maintain order. Written records, correspondence, and administrative accounts document how monarchs leveraged centralized authority to regulate urban and rural communities, standardize taxation, and administer justice. The enhanced capacity to govern over distance reduced dependence on feudal intermediaries, signaling a transition from the decentralized structures of earlier medieval Europe. By 1500, European political landscapes reflected the culmination of these trends. Centralized monarchies with standing armies, fiscal bureaucracies, and artillery-equipped fortifications dominated the balance of power. Residual feudal structures persisted in local governance, yet their influence was increasingly subordinated to royal authority. The combination of military innovation, professional administration, and fiscal reform provided a foundation for early modern states and redefined the nature of political power in Europe. Cultural change followed political reform. The administrative, military, and fiscal centralization of the late 15th century set the stage for broader intellectual, artistic, and economic developments. By consolidating authority, monarchs enabled greater investment in education, urban planning, and artistic patronage, linking structural political transformation with enduring societal and cultural effects. Before we continue exploring the transformation of Europe, hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon to receive your daily dose of Nightfall history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which moment in medieval history fascinates you the most? Your insight helps guide our next deep dive into the past.